Welcome to the EntreEd Talk podcast. We are your hosts, Toi Hirschman and
Laura McCall.
Join us as we dive into incredible stories from inspiring entrepreneurs around the world.
Whether you are an educator looking for ideas to engage students, a new learner, or someone who wants to be inspired, our guest journeys and their ideas will give you resources to create value and take your own leap into entrepreneurship.
We are so looking forward to sharing our message with you. And don't forget to like, rate, and subscribe to the EntreEd Talk podcast on whatever platform you listen. Welcome back, everybody, to another fun episode of the EntreEd Talk podcast. We are very excited to have Joe Brown here with us today. Joe is the Superintendent of Fairmont Area Schools in Fairmont, Minnesota. He has a great history in educational leadership and has served as a teacher, state senator, school board member, principal, and superintendent, and many, many more that we're going to dive into. As a superintendent, Joe serves a school district with 1,700 students and 260 teachers and support staff. Some of his notable accomplishments in this role include implementing the Agriculture Academy and Welding Academy, expanding the ECFE program to include 3- and 4-year-old students, eliminating a projected budget deficit of $1.5 million, overseeing construction of new elementary schools, and coordinating and implementing the Quality Compensation Plan, granting merit pay for teachers. All the teachers said, hey. He's also a graduate of the Martin County Leadership Program. And I forgot to put on there a rock and roll drummer, which we're going to dive into. So welcome, Joe. We're so excited to have you today.
Well, I'm so glad to visit the East Coast.
We always kind of start out with this question before we dive in. Why don't you give us a little bit, well, you're going to give us a lot of background on your sort of career path and trajectory and how you got to where you are today. And please don't leave out the juicy bits.
Well, okay. I was born and raised in eastern Iowa, right? Just a half a block from the Mississippi River, and lived in Iowa most of my life. Moved to Minnesota, though, in 1993. And originally, though, my career path, I was a rock and roll drummer for 8 years, and I taught drums in a music studio. Just bought a brand new set of Ludwigs about a year and a half ago that I have in my study at home. And we played a lot in the Chicago area and the Quad Cities and Eastern Iowa, and did that throughout my high school and college career. But when I went to school, it was during the late 60s and early 70s when I graduated from high school in 1969. And our high school burnt down in January of 68. That was the same year, of course, that we lost Dr. Martin Luther King. 60 days later, we lost Senator Bobby Kennedy. My two brothers were both in Vietnam. Tom was a Marine, and my brother Bill spent 30 years in the Navy, and he had 6 tours in Vietnam off the coast in an aircraft carrier. And I was very actively involved in the anti-war movement, and government and sociology and history and politics and economics were always a passion of mine. My father only went to the 5th grade. He was the oldest boy in Kansas during the Depression when his father committed suicide in front of him and his 4 siblings. My mother was a high school graduate, but my father received 2 newspapers every day and insisted on reading them. And we talked about government and politics a lot. And so when I went to school, I really focused on social science and history and government and economics, and ended up with a social science composite major. Worked the night shift at Cloud Corporation, manufacturing fire hydrants. So I'm an expert on how to build and how to manufacture fire hydrants. And I did that for 3 years. And then I taught high school government and economics for 3 years. I ran for the Iowa Senate when I was 27 and was elected, reelected 4 years later, and served 8 years. And my specialty in the Iowa Senate was education. I just have had a lifelong passion for education. And I'll point out that half of my educational career is in the private schools and half of my career is in the public schools. And I'm a big fan of education. I don't want to, Jefferson said it best, or I didn't hear him, but I read about it. Thomas Jefferson wrote that the only way for a representative democracy to work, you needed 3 things. You needed 1, a well-educated populace. Number 2, you needed access to public policy, information. And 3, you needed access to the people making the decisions, the politicians. And in my view, I just don't want a bunch of dumb in this country. I want smart people. And that's why I'm a big fan of public schools, private schools, home schools, online schools, and charter schools. And by the way, I'm a big fan, at least in the last 3 weeks, of distance learning education. But so I served in the Iowa Senate for 8 years. I got involved with the Sperry Univac company to automate our state legislature in Iowa. And then I got involved with library automation projects, and that took me all throughout the country. I traveled for 11 years. I traveled with Unisys, and I visited almost every major city in continental U.S. Really gave me an opportunity to learn a lot about our nation. At nighttime, I'd either go to a baseball game or a university library. And I just really love this country and have a great appreciation for what we have to offer. I moved to Minnesota in 1993. And in the day I moved to a town called Mankato, which, by the way, is the location where we had the last mass execution of American citizens. We executed 38 American Indians in 1862 because of the uprising. President Lincoln forgave many, he actually pardoned many of the American Indians, but 38 of them hung in Mankato. And Mankato is the home of Mankato State University. And anyway, I moved to Mankato, and the day I moved, there was an article in the Mankato Free Press that said, because of what the legislative action just did in Minnesota, they predicted, they changed the requirements for retirement. And the prediction was that within 2 years, there would be thousands of teaching jobs and hundreds of administrative jobs. So my wife and I were a blended family, got married in 1990. We have 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. We had 2 4s, 2 6s, an 8 and a 9 when we moved to Minnesota. And Robin went back to school to become a high school photography and art teacher, went to school during the daytime. I went to school at nighttime to become a high school principal. And I love the politics of education. That's the combination of politics and education. And I served as a high school principal for 10 years, and now I've been a school superintendent for 15. Of all the different careers I've had, from contract painting, state legislature, turret lathe operator, rock and roll drummer, high school teacher, principal, superintendent, marketing and sales rep, the one area that really prepared me the best for superintendent is rock and roll drummer. And let me explain that. Yeah. You know, as a rock and roll drummer, everybody depends on you to keep a steady beat at all times. And sometimes you have to play really soft. And sometimes you have to play really loud, like you're playing the solo from Inagata Davida. And sometimes you got to crash the cymbals. And sometimes you really have to do the drum rolls. And sometimes you have to play fast, and sometimes you have to play slow. However, whatever you're doing, you have to keep that steady beat. And as I look back at my career, the last 25 years as a school administrator, I would say that one characteristic I have is that I've kept a steady beat. But I'm always willing to do something very quickly. And that's what's made it so much fun to serve here in South Central Minnesota, because Fairmont's a great school system and we do a lot of fun.
Plus that's so awesome. Plus what a rich history. I was just thinking though too, you also know how to put out fires because of the fire hydrant.
Well, I do. And, you know, like I said, my high school burnt down in January '68, Clinton High School. When I was at Lee Soar Henderson in Minnesota, we had a school shooting the year and a half before Columbine. It was on 9/11. We had a student that came into the building with 122 rounds of ammo, 9mm and an assault rifle. And he only got one shot off. He shot our police officer as he was being arrested. It was a wound that was a head wound, but the police officer lived, and Sergeant Tom Nelson was back on the job in 2 weeks, and he finished up his career and retired. But that was a year and a half before Columbine, and that was way before we had thought about putting cameras in schools, way before we thought about hiring full-time school resource officers, way before we talked about locking doors. And so that experience has been one that has been with me for a long time. And ironically, it happened 4 years before the New York 9/11.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
So, I live with a drummer, Joe, and I said the other skill that you have is to multitask. Because I watch my son, and it's amazing. Yes, you're keeping the steady beat, but you also got a million things going on around you, and I can see his head spinning and counting as he's going and constantly creating. I want to jump back to your role in the Senate. I was a lobbyist for many years in DC, and I want to know what were the joys you found in being, and how did you marry your passions with education? You mentioned serving on some committees that led to being the teaching and then superintendent. But tell me some joys. Tell me just some amazing, like, woo-hoo highlights.
Well, the first 4 years I served in the Iowa Senate, again, I was in puberty. I was 27 years old. The average age of the Senate that year was around 58. I was named the ranking member of the Senate Ed Committee. So the Senate Ed, Iowa has 50 state senators and 100 state representatives. And at that time, the Republicans had majority control. I am a lifelong Democrat. And we were the minority, and so there were 10 members on the Senate Ed Committee, and Iowa does something very different than most states. In Iowa, the Standing Committee of Education is also the Funding Committee of Education. And so there were 10 members, 4 Democrats, 6 Republicans. And that was a great learning experience for me. I will tell you, it's a lot more fun to be in the minority, but you don't get anything done. But it's a lot more fun. I was 27 years old. I was single, had a good time, and but it prepared me for. And by the way, after my first year in the Senate, I worked as a laborer building a water treatment plant in Montezuma, Iowa, for the huge dollar amount of $5 an hour. And on the last day of my job, I was on scaffolding that collapsed, and I fell 24 feet. I fell between 2 re-rod bar. I lost my left kneecap. I broke my left elbow and hit my head. And because of that injury, I was in the hospital for a couple of months in traction, and my left leg was considered 25% disabled. So I got some work comp money, and I used that to go to graduate school at the University of Iowa. And I earned a master's degree in public administration with a specialty in labor relations. Well, I was 28 years old and 29 when I did my graduate work at Iowa. And by golly, that really prepared me to be a great negotiator as an education chair. Well, in 1982, the Democrats, for only the third time in Iowa history, the Democrats took over control of the House and Senate. And we had a Republican governor, Terry Branstad, who, by the way, served either 5 or 6 terms. And he currently is he's the ambassador to China right now. Okay. And Terry and I are very close friends. Terry's a Republican, but in fact, I voted for Terry Branstad in 1986. I voted for 2 Republicans in my life because they were both very pro-education. I'm a single issue voter. I vote for people that vote for education. Anyway, so in 1983, I became chair of the Senate Ed Committee, which in Iowa, about 65% of the entire state's budget in Iowa is spent on education. And I remember one time when Governor Branstad was being challenged by a Republican by the name of Fred Grandy, who you might remember was Gopher on Love Boat. Oh, he was a congressman from Iowa. Wow. And he challenged Terry Branstad when Terry was running for his 3rd term. And he challenged the governor. He said, Governor, you spend 65% of the state's budget on Iowa, on education. I think it's way too much. And Governor Branstad said, Fred, I'm looking forward to the day that we spend 75%. And let me tell you why. Because the money we don't spend on education, what do we spend it on? Prisons, welfare, things that broke, okay? And so the more we can have a progressive platform and get well-educated people. And of course, Iowa and Minnesota for many, many years, and Wisconsin, 3 states that usually are number 1, 2, and 3 in terms of ACT scores. And it's just a great educational experience here in the Midwest, what we used to call the old Louisiana Purchase. Anyway, back to my legislative days. The couple of pieces of legislation that I'm most proud of, Iowa was the first state in the nation to pass the open enrollment law. And I received a rose-colored letter, which I still have at home, by a woman from a little town called Lakota, Iowa, up in the north central part of the state. And there was a little district of Lakota that had 103 students, K-12. Okay, think about that for a minute. Graduated about 7 or 8 kids. Well, there were a group of parents that wanted their children to have a more, just a richer high school experience. So they illegally enrolled their kids into a neighboring district. They set up illegal mailboxes, okay? And they enrolled their children. They were there for multiple years. Well, the Lakota superintendent filed a lawsuit against them and demanded that they repay him the lost state aid, which at that time was about $5,000 per student. There were 13 students involved. They did it for 3 years. Now, this is during the late 70s and early 80s when the farm crisis was hitting all the Midwest. And people were going broke, people were losing farms. And I could just see this, I could just envision this woman sitting at her kitchen table on the farm, handwriting this letter on rose-colored letterhead paper and sending it to me. I got that letter, I read it, I started to cry. I called her up and I said, would you be willing to come and testify in front of the Senate Ed Committee? She said, absolutely. I said, when could you come? She said, tomorrow? I said, well, I have to give at least a 48-hour notice to call a committee. So she decided to come on a Thursday. And she brought all 13 kids and the 5 families, the moms and dads all came. I'm getting choked up now just thinking about this. There wasn't a dry eye in the place. And I invited the Associated Press, the television stations or radio stations. I invited them. I said, you guys might want to come to this committee hearing because I think it's going to be interesting. Well, the bottom line is the House and Senate passed the bill. I was a rookie chair, never thought twice about, geez, maybe I should go down and talk to the governor. Governor vetoed the bill. That summer, I was out in Denver, Colorado, because I was a member of the Education Commission of the states, which is made up of governors and chairs and vice chairs and ranking members of education committees. And I was on a panel discussion, and I talked about this open enrollment law. Well, this guy came up afterwards, and he said, I'd like to learn more about that. Well, his name was Rudy Perpich, and Rudy was the current governor of Minnesota. Well, Minnesota then in 1984, they passed the first open enrollment law that the governor signed. Well, I went back. I didn't, Iowa and Minnesota, we have lots of jokes between the two states. And I keep telling people I have the best of both worlds. I have an Iowa education and a Minnesota paycheck. Well, anyway, in 1985, then we came back and we passed, Iowa became the second state to pass the open enrollment law. And now I think there's about 38 states that have open enrollment because it never made any sense to me. We don't tell people where to go to church. We don't tell people what grocery store to shop at. We don't tell people where to get gas based on their zip code. Why do we tell people where they have to go to public school because of their zip code? And I think public schools should compete against each other and against charters and online schools and private schools and now distance learning. I think we ought to have lots of competition. And I do believe this. I think open enrollment has made public education better because we have to compete. And if we don't have children, we don't get money. We don't have money. We don't have a budget. Don't have a budget. We don't need people. Isn't it great?
Amen, brother.
So that was one. The other piece of legislation that I worked on that I thought was interesting is Iowa had a very interesting law that if you were a teacher, and let's say first year teacher comes in and they would ask you, geez, would you like to coach anything? Well, yeah, I'll coach a couple sports. Well, let's say you're coaching the 7th and 8th grade girls basketball team and you have 7th and 8th grade girls track and maybe you do something else, baseball or something. Well, 5, 6, 10 years later, the teacher goes, I just want to teach. Well, the school board would then say, well, if you give up any of those coaching contracts, you have to resign. You resign your teaching contract because they're all tied together. And so we went ahead and we passed legislation called the Separation of Coaching and Teaching Contracts, which you have to have an individual teaching contract. And then for every co-curricular or teaching job that you have after that, you have to have an individual contract. And a teacher can resign from an individual coaching or co-curricular contract and still maintain their teaching contract. So those are the two big ones I remember. And once again, here's the sad part about where we are today as a nation and where we were back then. Back then on every Monday night, and this is, you'll appreciate this as a lobbyist, every Monday night, the AFL-CIO, which they had their headquarters about 2 blocks from the state capitol building in Des Moines. Well, they would have on Monday night beer and pretzels. That's what it was called, but it was a full bar and a full smorgasbord of food. And the rule was they would open up the bar a half an hour after the first House adjourned. Well, the Senate always adjourns first because there's fewer of us and House members can't be quiet. And so the Senate would get there, but beer and pretzels were open to House members, Senate members, staffers, members of the governor's staff, members of the congressional delegation if they were back in the state capitol, members of the Supreme Court could come, and members of the news media. There was one rule. You can use any information you hear and you learn for background information only, no quotes. No quotes. And by golly, that's the way it's been forever. And so that was a time that Republicans and Democrats, rural, urban, could get together, young and old, have a few sodas at night, have something to eat, talk. Where else can you sit down and have a beer with a member of the Supreme Court of your home state? Or where can you sit and talk to the governor and lieutenant governor and just have a brewski or two? But Iowa does that, or at least they did. And now think about Congress today. Think about how irrational and how partisan things are. Now, again, did we fight for things that we cared about? Sure. But we felt very strongly that, you have to work together. And again, that skill is what we've taken into the school administration. I've worked now for 45 years in my life, knock on wood. I've never had a grievance filed, ever. And last time we negotiated our 2-year teaching contract, it took us an hour and 20 minutes. We just have a very good, and by the way, I'm a former union president when I was teaching, and I had a 100% voting record with the teachers union. There's no reason why school administrators and teachers and support staff can't work together for a common cause. And if you're not willing to do that, you probably should get out of the business.
You just described the best of policy. You reminded me of all the reasons. Like you, I have an MPA, and in days like these times, it's really easy, I think, to get down on policy. But, you reminded me of when I was a young lobbyist, I ate my way through DC at places like you're talking about, the unions opening up their doors. And it's phenomenal when it works. And it seems that you've been at the right place at the right time and had the best of the political world.
Well, and let me point out too, I'm still very actively involved. In Minnesota, they call Democrats Democratic Farmer Labor. Yeah. It's a DFL party. It was a party that was founded by 2 people you might have heard about before. They were both vice presidents, Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale.
Yeah, awesome.
They created the Democratic Farmer Labor Party back in the 50s. And the DFL party, so I am the Senate 27 District DFL chair of the DFL party, which represents 2 towns of Albert Lee and Austin. Austin is the home of Hormel Foods, Spam.
Oh, I love Spam.
Skippy peanut butter. Hey, there's 13 different kinds now, Toi.
I'm excited. I think there's a sriracha.
Well, next time we're at the same conference, they sell a case of Spam with 12 different flavors plus 1. Yeah, and the Spam Museum is located in Austin. It's beside more people visit the Mall of America. The second tourist attraction in Minnesota is the Spam Museum. It's really fascinating. It really is. Okay.
Sorry, I had to have a laugh there. So to piggyback on we talk obviously at EntreEd, we talk a lot about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial mindsets and how schools can build that into their culture. Your background is so big that I mean, you've just made so many different pivots and shifts. And I mean, I would believe that leads to how you kind of have this entrepreneurial mindset. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your leadership style and how you're able to pivot and do some of these really innovative things in your school system. And I also want to mention, I did meet Joe at a NACCE conference. We've talked about NACCE before, the National Association for Community College Entrepreneurship. So I know you like entrepreneurs.
Right. Well, and I thanks for reminding me. I was bringing up the idea about my politics, and I point out that I serve in a district in Martin County, Minnesota, which is on the Iowa border, right in the center of the state, east-west, but it's right on the Iowa border. Of the 87 counties we have in Minnesota, Martin County is the most conservative. I think Donald Trump got 75% of the vote and Hillary got 25%. And I point that out because everybody knows my politics. And I had a businessman a couple of years ago who said, Brown, everybody knows that you're a liberal Democrat, but you're running the district like a conservative Republican, and we really appreciate that. and the bottom line is, we're sitting on a fund balance, which most districts would die for. It's taken us 10 years to get here. But I do believe this, that, one of the roles that we have, Minnesota has a law that is called the world's best workforce, and it has 5 pillars. All kids are ready for kindergarten, all kids reading by the end of 3rd grade, that we're closing the academic achievement gap among the socioeconomic and racial groups, that all kids are college and career ready. And for the life of me, I forgot the 5th one. But back to the career and college readiness. We expect all of our high school graduates in Minnesota to be both career and college ready. And the neat thing about Martin County, let me explain our county a little bit. We only have 20,000 people in the whole county. We produce 1.9 million hogs every year. We have 2 ethanol plants. We have 1 soybean crushing plant, which they are currently adding a $100 million addition to the soybean crushing plant. We have thousands of acres of corn and soybean. We have wind turbines. We're one of the few places in the world that have these 3 attributes. We have water, we have soil, and we have wind. And it's just we're the breadbasket of Minnesota. This part of the state, we produce not only breadbasket, but we're kind of the brain basket. We have such great kids. In our high school, we have 22 college classes taught. By the way, we're one of the few counties that we have no college in our county, no community college, no college. And so we have 22 college classes that are taught by our high school faculty. We have a great band, great choir, great orchestra program, great theater program, speech, 35 clubs and organizations kids can belong to. And I mentioned 22 separate sports. And I point that out because to make that happen in this area, you have to work very closely with the manufacturing and the agricultural community. Well, after my first year here, we had just cut $1.4 million. We eliminated 40 jobs. And I had a group of people come to me and they say, Joe, what would it take to reinstate the ag program at Fairmont? 25 years ago, we had a really good ag program. We had an FFA program. And remember, I just told you the demographics of Martin County, 1.9 million hogs, 2 ethanol plants, soybean crushing plant, 1,000 acres of corn and soybean. But we had no ag program because it was cut because of finances. And so I told this group of business people and farmers, I said, we would reinstate the program if you raised $300,000 in cash. And they said, what would you do with $300,000 in cash? I said, well, we'll go out and we'll recruit an ag teacher. We'll set up his or her lab. We'll purchase the curriculum. We'll run the program for 3 years. We'll pay for the FFA program. And at the end of the 3 years, if it's successful, we'll take it over. Now, this was in November, right before Thanksgiving. Second week in January, they came, they gave me a check for $308,000. And they apologized. They said, Joe, we're sorry it took 6 weeks to raise this money. But, we had Thanksgiving, we had Christmas, we had people that went down south for the winter. We're sorry it took 6 weeks. They said, when could you do this? When could you implement it? I said, we'll implement it this coming school year. And so we've now had the ag program for 8 years. At the end of the 3 years, by the way, we still had $108,000 left that we hadn't spent. And I went to them and said, can we use it for a 4th year? And they said, no, you promised you'd take it over. And I said, well, can we use it for a project? And they said, what would you like to do? I said, well, we'd like to build a greenhouse. Oh yeah, you can use it for that. So we built a $128,000 greenhouse. So our ag department is fully funded. Amber Cyber does a great job with that. We now have we have 40 apple trees that the Rotary Club donated. So we have an apple orchard that's growing. Now, that all ties in because I learned something from someone here in Minnesota that if you want to raise money, call it an academy. So we developed the Ag Academy.
Thank you for the idea. Tori, we're on it, right?
We're on top of that.
Keep rolling. So the next one was Bob Bonine. I think you met Bob.
Mm-hmm.
Did you meet Bob? He's at the beer. Okay. Well, Bob's our welding teacher and our automotive instructor. And after my second year too, Bob came to me and said, Joe, I need $10,000 because I have so many kids signed up for welding. I need $10,000 for the wire feed and the gas. So I went to the school board and asked them for another $10,000, and they said, no, Joe, we just cut $1.4 million. Go out and raise the money. So I sent letters to 20 different companies and asked if they would be willing to adopt a welding booth for $1,000. And if they had decided to adopt a welding booth, we could buy a brand new welder. We could get gas and wire feed for the year. And then we would make a really nice sign that we'd put up in each welding booth to say who dedicated this booth, who donated it. And then we give those companies first crack at our kids. So they can come in during class time, they can talk about their business, they can pass out applications. And we actually had a company called Zerke Built Manufacturing that moved to town 2 years ago, mainly because of our welding academy. They have about 60 welders. We have 14 of our high school graduates working at Zerke Built Manufacturing right now. And I asked Greg Zerke, the owner, I said, what do you like about our kids? He said, oh, I love your Fairmont grads. They know how to weld. They know how to read blueprints. They're drug-free. They actually come to work every day, and they're just darn nice kids. And I said, wow, that's a great commercial. And so we now have the Welding Academy with 20 welding booths. Well, now we also have an automotive academy. We also now have a culinary arts academy. And the academy we're working on now is a construction trades academy. And we've raised a few $100,000 for that. But our goal, we're looking at probably adding a $6 million facility onto our school because we want to work out a deal with Johnson Controls to set up a HVAC academy. Here's the deal. In the next 48 months, Minnesota needs to replace 200,000 skilled workers because people are my age. You know, they're in their mid to late 60s and they're retiring. Well, nationwide, in the next 48 months, we need to replace 213,000 HVAC engineers.
Oh my gosh.
Now, these are not people that just go and do home installations. We're talking about people that put HVAC into businesses, hospitals, manufacturing facilities, that type of thing. And so Johnson Controls, there's 2 places in this country where they have HVAC engineer schools set up, labs, and we'll be the 3rd one. So that's our next goal.
Cool.
What was your question? I forgot your question.
I was just asking about how you answered it because I was asking about how your leadership style allows you to be nimble, and you totally answered that question.
Well, actually, it ties in with COVID-19 for a little bit. Here's what we're learning about this disaster that we're into right now.
Yeah. Oh.
Business, schools can't do it by ourselves, but neither can businesses. Manufacturing, corporations, they can't do it by themselves. We need to integrate the business community with the educational community, and we need to form tighter relationships. Once again, I'm not just saying public schools, public, private, online, charter. We need to work together. We're one nation, e pluribus unum, out of many one. We got to stop fighting against each other. We have no time for this. There are some things the national system has to do. There are some things at the local level we will have to do, but together we need to get it done.
As I'm hearing you seem very entrepreneurial in spirit. You clearly run as a superintendent, as an entrepreneur, and very strong business mindset. but I can see how that comes down to your local teachers and all the academies that you've created or helped them create. We always like to know, what do you tell the other teachers out there who are struggling, and maybe districts who don't have the type of support that you're giving your teachers and leaders? What would you say mentoring teachers around the country?
I would say, come work at Fairmont.
I'm get an HVAC degree.
Yes.
Well, we'll the application with the show notes of the podcast.
I carry business cards with me all the time. I am constantly recruiting good people. I've had the fortune here. I've actually hired 82 of the 124 faculty that now teach at Fairmont, because I've been here 10 years, and we've had just a number of people that have retired. Once you come to Fairmont, very few people ever leave, because you really have to want to be in this part of the state. We're a town of 11,000. We do have electricity and paved roads, but we're in a very agricultural area. We're about 2 hours away from the Twin Cities. We're about 2 hours away from Mayo Hospital in Rochester. By the way, we do have a Mayo Hospital here in Fairmont. Just have a great medical area here. No, I would say this. I would say, I remember President Kennedy, after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, he made a comment: success has 1,000 fathers, failure is an orphan. Well, I've been known to kill programs that fail. I think it's important for us to do that. If a program's not working or we're not getting results, it's important for us to eliminate that program, do it quickly, and put money and put effort into those individuals and those programs. Like you met Bob O'Neill. Boy, what an entrepreneur he is. I mean, him and his father have a racing team. They race cars and trucks, and he's just a very strong innovator. He used to be an elementary teacher, and his passion, though, is vocational, and he switched over a number of years ago and has created great academies. And I also would say this, that in this day and age, teachers are so important that, I've always asked, when I first came here, I remember my first time I introduced myself to the entire staff, I said, be careful what you ask for, because I will rarely ever tell you no, but you'll have to answer two questions for me. How are we going to pay for it? And how are we going to fit it into the schedule? Time and money. And I don't know if I've said no to anybody, but you have to prove to me that you can do those two things. And once you can, and I got to tell you, we have some of the neatest faculty here. People keep asking, I'm in the district office every day. I haven't taken a day off since COVID-19 happened. I feel it's very important for me to be here and show a presence, but I just love our faculty, and we're doing distance learning, but we still have a lot of faculty that are here.
Wow. Wow, this is amazing. So Joe, thank you so much for sharing. We like to kind of keep this at a drive time, so we're gonna wrap up. But how can anyone that's interested in learning more about you or about your school system, or who might want to apply, find out how to do that? Where can they go?
Well, yes, if they go to Fairmont, and it's FAIRMONT.K12.MN.US, they could certainly email me, and my email address is initial jbrown@fairmont.K12.MN.US. But more importantly, let me give out my personal cell phone. It's area code 507-438-9083. Once again, 507-438-9083. And if anybody wants to call and chat anytime, it'd be great, because
awesome.
we're just having fun.
Well, thank you so much. And yeah, like I said, we love when we have people that can give us a part two, because that'll make next year really easy.
Okay, sounds great.
But thanks for being here, and we've so enjoyed our conversation with you.
Thank you, Toi. Thank you, Laura. Have a great weekend.